Gary, I have a favor to ask of you. Would you be willing to go up to my office and see if I left my glasses on my desk? They would be very helpful to have. Okay, well, we're starting to study in Nehemiah. I'm excited about this. Many things we can learn. One of the great things is we just see God's sovereignty in the affairs of man and how he works to accomplish his will when what might seem to be a very difficult situation, conditions, and how he uses even the heathen to accomplish his purpose, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. We'll see many examples of good leadership, and that's really the theme of the lessons, is lessons in leadership. So the first thing I'm going to ask, I thought about this for a while, and of course we'll be talking about this as we go through the lesson, but do I need to turn this on? Okay, so I'm going to ask you. As I said, we'll be going through this for 13 weeks, but what are some marks? What would you say are marks of a spiritual leader? Anyone? Well, what characteristics? What would you look for in a spiritual leader? Okay, good. What else? Be godly, yes, absolutely. Okay, well, let me tell you the ones I came up with. And this is just a few minutes, and they aren't even necessarily the ones that are going to come up in this lesson, but some things to think about. Recognition of his abilities and limitations. If you have someone leading a group of people into an area they know nothing about, there, believe me, can be challenges. Relationship with dependence on God, very important, like Pastor Hicks said. A concern for those he leads. A good leader always has concern for those he leads. Okay, hair trigger here. Concern for those he leads. And communication skills. What did you say, Arden? Well, I know, but I just barely tapped it and it went nuts. Okay, we will see many examples of godly leadership traits demonstrated in the life of Nehemiah. As we look at Nehemiah, and okay, come on. There we go. As we look at Nehemiah and the events, we need to take a little bit of a look at history. As you know, by the time Nehemiah comes, both Israel and Judah have been removed from the land. And you can see here from the map the Assyrian captivity in 722 BC, and you can follow the blue line to see that, where Assyria came in and conquered Israel and took them into captivity. God did that for two reasons. One, judgment for their sin, their idolatry and disobedience, but also he clearly says he did it as a warning to Judah. Judah did not heed that warning, and you'll see that the Babylonian armies took Judah captive, finished up in 586, actually started in, I think it was 605 BC, it was a period of time there, a couple waves, but took them into exile in Babylon. But there were also returns on the part of those that were taken from Judah, as you see under Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel in 538 BC, we'll look at that a little bit later, and then return under Ezra, we'll look at that briefly, and then we will get to the return under Nehemiah. And just to put it in a format maybe a little bit easier to see, you can see the timeline there of the different deportations and restorations, beginning with those that were taken from Judah, nobility in Daniel, and leaders in Ezekiel, and then King Zedekiah in the last. And then you see Zerubbabel leads a group back, Ezra leads a group back, and then Nehemiah will lead a group. So these all factor in to what we're going to look at in the lesson today. Okay, let's look at Nehemiah, the man himself. Not much is known about him. There's no background information given other than his father's name. But there are just a couple things. His name is significant, the comfort of Jehovah. So, this is kind of obvious, but what would you gather about Nehemiah's parents if they gave him that name? They were believers in the God of Israel, right, of Jehovah. And then also, as we look at Nehemiah, we see his actions are a reflection of a godly upbringing and godly character, a godly man. So we can understand those things about Nehemiah. His significance, and he will play a major role, and this is what we'll be looking at for the next 13 weeks. But we find him here residing in the Persian king's winter palace. And you know what? We didn't read the passage. Would someone first please read the first 3 verses of Nehemiah chapter 1? Any volunteers? Go ahead.
The words of Nehemiah the son of Hachaliah. And it came to pass in the month Kislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan the palace, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came, he and certain men of Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, which were left of the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said unto me, the remnant that are left of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire.
Okay, so now we see the setting. Now, what was Nehemiah's function in the court? He was the cupbearer, which kind of interesting. I found out some things about cupbearer. Number one, it was a position of high rank. It wasn't just a, give it to any servant type position. It was high trust, high rank. Duty was to pour and serve the drinks of the royal table. So as part of that, he was a taste tester to protect the king from poisoning. But also because of that, also many feel the cupbearer would serve many of butler type duties. Had a close relationship with the king, was also often a confidant or an advisor to the king. So Nehemiah is in a powerful position, a high position there. Certain qualifications that I found that would have been in place for someone in that position, they had to be physically attractive. And a great deal was put on it because it was someone at the king's table. They had to be attractive to look at. Modest, industrious, and courageous. So the fact that Nehemiah was a cupbearer, we know in addition to being a godly man, he met those criteria. Interesting to see there are 3 instances of cupbearers mentioned in the Old Testament. The first is Genesis in the account of Joseph. And we see here the word butler is translated from the word that is translated into cupbearer in other places. And it came to pass after these things that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And of course, they were in prison and interpreting the king's dream and so forth and so on. Then our passage in Nehemiah, Lord, I beseech thee, let now thine ear be attentive to the prayer of thy servant and to the prayer of thy servants who desire to fear thy name and prosper. I pray thee, thy servant this day, and grant his mercy in the sight of this man, for I was the king's cupbearer. And then when the queen of Egypt came to visit, or not Egypt, but, she came to visit, David, and we see this account in 2 Chronicles. And the meat of the table and the setting of his servants and the attendance of his ministers and their apparel, his cupbearers also, and their apparel, and his ascent by which he went up to the house of the Lord. There was no more spirit in her. So there's many things there, including the cupbearers, that were very, very impressive. Nehemiah was a foreigner in the land. Foreigner really may not be the exactly right word to use. Probably his grandparents came in, and so he was born in the land, but he was a Jew, and he was practicing the Jewish religion, so he wasn't part of the mainstream culture and society. And yet he was chosen to serve in a very high position in the palace. Now, thinking about that, what are some other big examples of someone that were really not part of the culture, but ended up serving in high position or with great influence? A couple of real obvious ones. Yes? You say Joseph? Yes? Who else? Daniel? And then I was thinking of Esther. She wasn't in a power, in a role maybe of ruling power, but she had great influence. And there might be others I didn't think of. But interesting question. Knowing that God controlled key people, or what does that tell you about Nehemiah's God? We'll ask that question first. He's in control, right? And he uses his people in his way in whatever the setting might be. So to apply that to our troubled situation today, yes, you have a question? Yes. I think I heard everything you said. Okay. By the way, as many of you know, I don't hear very well, and the masks really make it harder. So if you do have something to say, don't be afraid to really speak up. You won't offend me. I like yelling. It makes it easier for me. I am wearing an assisted hearing device, but it's one of the cheap ones that amplify everything. So I can really hear myself. I can hear the rushing sound of wind, even though there is none. It's just a noise this thing makes. And I can hear the click of this thing. I hear a lot of things. Okay, so apply this to our situation today at a very troubled time. Knowing that God controlled key people and events in Bible history, can we safely say that he controls key people and events in our lives today? And Proverbs 21:1, some of you probably know that verse, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. As the rivers of water, he turneth it whithersoever he will. So as we look at how God used people in this event that weren't part of the ruling class, the high society, to accomplish his purpose, I think we can have great confidence that God still, even though he doesn't exercise ultimate control in every area, he does have the authority and the power that he is in control, and that can give us some comfort. Okay, let's take a look at the setting. First of all, we see the history of the kings that lead up to this. First, there was after the Babylonian ruler, Cyrus conquered Babylon, decreed permission for Jews to return to Judah. After him was Cambyses, and he was not at all favorable to the Jews. Then Darius I authorized Jews to rebuild the temple, and that was a very significant event. And then Xerxes, the king that married Esther, spared the Jews from Haman's wicked plot. And then the king that was in rule at the time we're looking at now, Artaxerxes I, authorized Nehemiah to return and rebuild Jerusalem's wall. So you kind of get a sense there of the history and what has been transpiring and leading up to this situation. The challenge. Okay, 3 descriptions are given. I just told you. Is there a secret to this thing? Just maybe a light touch. Okay. 3 descriptions. So look at verse 3, and you probably saw on the next slide anyway. But how was the situation in Jerusalem described to Nehemiah? His brother Hananiah came, and Nehemiah showed concern for the people. He asked, and he was given a report in verse 3. And there's 3 words there that really describe it. Chapter 1, verse 3. Here, I'll give you a hint. Great affliction, reproach, and broken down. So Nehemiah, out of concern for his fellow Jews, for the beloved city of Jerusalem, Hananiah comes. And by the way, there's a 900 to 1,000 miles between the summer palace and Jerusalem. Yes?
Yeah, the distance from Shushan to Jerusalem is 1,000 miles, and it took 4 miles of walking to get from point A to point B. So, and Nehemiah made that trip a couple of times.
It's quite a journey, yes. Quite a journey. And,
4 months just to get where you want to go.
yeah, and Hananiah had just made that trip to Shushan, the other winter palace of the king. And again, Nehemiah, he's showing concern. He's asking. Probably the last he heard, he probably got some reports of the rebuilding that was going on under EZRA. Several things that happened since then that he probably wasn't aware of. So let's take a look at these things. I mean, not only affliction, which would be bad enough, but great affliction. Affliction has the idea of bad, calamity, displeased, displeasure, distress, evil. As I followed the Hebrew word to the Old Testament, almost always it was connected with some evil or some wicked event that was transpiring. So Nehemiah's kindred in Judah wrestled against discouragement and danger. Their enemies opposed them relentlessly. Both political and military pressure was brought to bear in an effort to crush their rebuilding efforts. And their disobedience to God brought consequences as well. So as we look at this, reproach, what did the condition described at Hananiah lead outsiders to think about the God of the Jews? Look at 2 Chronicles 6:6. But I have chosen Jerusalem that my name may be there. So there's a strong, powerful connection between God and Jerusalem. So to see the condition as it was described in Nehemiah, what might that make someone think about the God of Jerusalem, the God of the Jewish people, to see his city in that condition? Their apathy and neglect gave God a bad name. It harmed the reputation of God's name to see what had happened in his city. The question can be well asked, if God is so great, why didn't they rebuild the city? And then if God's temple was surrounded by ruins, let's just say, left from an invasion that happened or why was God's temple still surrounded by ruins? Left from an invasion that happened decades earlier. There's much time hadn't that been taken care of. Now, so let me ask you a question. Was there a problem with God or God's response? What was the problem with? The problem was not with the God of Jews, it was with the Jews. Would someone please look up Haggai, chapter 1, verses 3 through 10? That gives us a picture of what was going on with the people during this time frame. Who wants to volunteer to read that? I'm going to volunteer someone in a moment if no one volunteers. Are you looking it up, Larry? Yeah, kind of in the back of the Old Testament where the books are close together and hard to find. At chapter 1, verses 3 through 10.
Then came the word of the Lord by Haggai, the prophet, saying, It is time for you, O ye, to dwell in your citadel houses, and this house lies waste. Now therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Ye have sown much, and bring in little, yet eat, but ye have not enough. Ye drink, but ye are not filled with drink. Ye clothe you, but there is none warm, and he that earneth wages, to put it into a bag with holes. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Go up to the mountain, and bring wood, and build a house, and I will take pleasure in it, and I will glorify, saith the Lord. Ye looked for much, and lo, it came too little, and when ye brought it home, I did blow upon it. Why, saith the Lord of hosts, because of mine house that is waste, and ye run every man unto his own house. Therefore the heaven over you is stayed from dew, and the earth is stayed from her fruit.
Okay, so what was the main interest? What was most important to the people that's being described here, the people in Jerusalem during this time? What were they working toward? Well, they started off with that, but then something happened. Talked about their sealed houses, okay, fancy houses, their well-being. They began to work towards comfort and ease for themselves and prosperity for themselves and neglecting the temple and the city. And what was the result of that? How did their efforts to build prosperity turn out? It did not work, yes. Yes. Is that the passage? I think I heard the word, put money in a pocket with holes in it. Is that in that passage? I think it is. Okay, well, maybe that's another passage. But yeah, as they tried to accumulate wealth for themselves, God confounded their efforts. They weren't doing what God had called them, wanted them to do, and He didn't allow their efforts to build up a life of comfort and prosperity for themselves. He did not allow success in that. So let's take kind of an overview look here of what had happened. Is it in there? Okay. Okay, oh, before we do that, one more thing. Disrepair. In the passage, it said broken down. So things were in disrepair. In his report to Nehemiah, Hanani stated the wall of Jerusalem is broken down and the gates thereof are burned with fire. And of course, the wall was torn down and destroyed during the Babylonian invasion, but had been partially rebuilt after that. But it was torn down, it was destroyed or damaged again. So as we look at this, there's a series of events. Ezra led a group of Jews back to Jerusalem. An effort was made to rebuild the temple. So they started off, and they were doing what they should have been doing well. Their work on the temple extended to rebuilding the walls. However, they were working under permission from King Cyrus. He wrote a letter, said, these people have my authority, and plus he gave them money, supplies, and so forth to do this work. But what they did went beyond what the king had allowed in his letter. That came to be knowledge of some enemies of the Jews and those that wanted to be friends of the king. So who will turn to Ezra for me? There's several passages there. We'll take one time. Ezra, just the book before Nehemiah, so this one is easy to find. Mr. Hodgins, would you do that? Ezra chapter 4. Yes, it does. And right now, read verse 12 through 16. Sixteen.
Be it known unto the king that the Jews which came up from thee to us are come unto Jerusalem, building the rebellious and the bad city, and set up the walls thereof, and joined the foundations. Be it known now unto the king that, if this city be builded and the walls set up again, then will they not pay toll, tribute, and custom, and so thou shalt endamage the revenue of the king. Now, because we have maintenance from the king's palace, and it was not meet for us to see the king's dishonor, therefore have we sent and certified the king, that search may be made in the book of the records of thy fathers. So shalt thou find in the book of the records, and know that this city is a rebellious city, and hurtful unto kings and provinces, that they may have moved sedition within the same of old time. For which cause was this city destroyed? We certify unto the king that, if this city be built again, and the walls thereof set up, by this means thou shalt have no portion on this side the river.
Okay, so save your place there in Ezra chapter 4. Enemies of the Jews, two Samaritans, Raham and Shimshai, alerted King Artaxerxes to this, claiming it was a threat to his power. So it's kind of interesting to look at. Be it known unto the kings, it was the Jews that came up from thee to us, have come unto Jerusalem, building the rebellious and the bad city. So right away we see the mindset, the framework that they are coming from, and how they want to present Jerusalem, which is not accurate. They were not rebuilding the walls in any effort to rebel against the king. They were rebuilding the walls, number one, to honor God and God's city, but number two, walls at that time were necessary. It was a vital defense. Be it known unto thy king that if this city be builded, and so forth and so on, they'll refuse to pay toll and tribute, and it'll be damage to the king. Now, in verse 14, now because we have maintenance from the king's palace, and it is not meet for us to see the king's honor, how are they setting themselves up? How are they presenting themselves to be? I mean, they really want to present themselves as king. We are your friends, right? They're building favor with the king. And they're not really being honest in the report to Jerusalem about this. And then they come to the conclusion that if this be allowed to continue, the walls are set up, then the king would lose any influence he had in that area. Okay, Arden, if you'd read verse 21.
Here be now commandment to cause these men to cease, and that this city be not built until another commandment shall be given from me.
Okay, so the king, they told the king what to do. He did respond that way. He sent a letter saying this work has to be stopped. In order, in his mind and in the mind of these people that were presenting themselves as the king's friend, to preserve the king's position. And as a result of that, in verses 23 through 24, Arden, the last section of chapter 4, if you would read those.
Take heed now, that ye fail not to do this. Why should damage grow to the hurt of the king? Now, when the copy of the king Artaxerxes' letter was read before Raham and Shimshai, the scribe, and their companions, they went up in haste to Jerusalem unto the Jews, and made them to cease by force and power. Then ceased the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem. So
Okay, so second year of the reign of Darius. So this all happened a little bit before Nehemiah's time, but we see the result of this in Nehemiah's time. The king said the work had to stop. We read in the last verse here that with force and power, they actually went beyond the intention of the king's letter, mounted an attack on the Jews, destroyed the newly rebuilt sections of the Jerusalem wall. Now imagine how the Jews must have felt about that. They had been allowed to return. They had been given supplies and money by the person who was king at that time. And then they were forcefully stopped. The work was stalled. So how might they have felt at that time? Obviously discouraged. They had probably used up a great deal of the resources that the king had provided for this work. So there would be an occasion for perhaps discouragement and frustration. If that's the case, if they were discouraged, if they were frustrated, if they stopped the work at that time, what does that tell you about the mindset of the people? What were they focused on? Or let me ask it this way, what were they not focused on? Yeah, not on God. Not doing God's will, not on God's provision. It was a miracle that they had been allowed to return to the land in the first place. In fact, the first return, it was in fulfillment of God's prophecy through Jeremiah. So it was a miracle that they'd been allowed to return. God had done that. What God had done before, he could do again. If they would have set their minds to doing God's work God's way, he would have granted success, but they became discouraged. They became frustrated, and because of that, ceased the work. So I want us to see what Nehemiah's response to that was. I'll read Nehemiah Chapter 1, verse 4. Before I do that, I want to take a moment. Now, put yourself in Nehemiah's shoes. You are a Jew by heritage. You were born and raised in a foreign land. You're in a high position in the king's palace. Life is good for you from a worldly perspective. You have the king's confidence. You have a certain amount of security and wealth. And so you receive this report. What might your response be? What's that? Yeah. Kind of facetious way of saying it, too bad, so sad. Yeah. Or he might say, yeah, well, I'll pray for you, brother. Or what can I do from my position without giving anything up to be a benefit or a help to you? So there are a lot of ways Nehemiah could have responded. But we see real character and godliness in Nehemiah's response. And of course, we'll see how his attitude, his response here carries out in the future and future lessons. But listen to verse 4. And it came to pass, when I heard these words, that I sat down and wept, and mourned certain days, and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. So what was his response? Tears. He was moved. He was saddened by the report he heard. Fasting. He wanted to remove other things that might sidetrack his thinking, other things that might get in the way, any sense of his own well-being and pleasure, and focus solely on this situation and how God might use him, what God would have him to do. He fasted. And fasting is not something perhaps that's done much in this age, but it is a great way of really removing a lot of distractions and focusing just in on God and what God would have you to do in any given situation. And of course, the ultimate answer to any problem is to pray. We know that we have a God in heaven that knows everything about the problem, has the power to solve the problem, already in his mind knows what the solution is, has a plan for us to take a role in solving the problem. And so why not go to God and avail ourselves of that strength, that power, that wisdom, that direction? And yet so many times we have the mindset, I need to figure this out. I need to do this. I need to do that. And it's really somewhat foolish not to go to God first and say, Lord, what would you have me to do? And then after asking, what would you have me to do, say, God, give me the power, the strength, the tools to do that. And that was Nehemiah's approach, a very godly approach to the situation at hand. Set aside his own ease, his own comfort, and say, the Lord has something for me here. There's something that he has blessed me. He has benefited me in my life. Now, in the position I am in, there's something he wants me to do from this position. In fact, because of his position, he could do things that no one else could do. He had an influence, an approach to the king that no one else had. Nehemiah could have easily ignored his homeland. After all, he enjoyed the comforts of palace life in Persia. His love for God and God's people, however, prevented him from adopting such an insensitive response. His heart ached for God's people and God's name. In the coming account, we will learn that he risked his life to restore both to the former glory. Of course, God proved faithful once again as he responded to Nehemiah's deep faith. And, as we just go through our normal life, we hear of things all the time, of people, some of our missionaries going through great travail, great turmoil, great difficulties. Perhaps even relatives or friends that are going through spiritual struggles or oppression because of their belief. And, I would hope that as we look at this, we would think, that if that's not the way I've responded to these situations, that is the way I should respond. Sensitivity and concern for those that are hurting. A focus on what would God have me to do? How would he have me do it? And, of course, prayer, asking for God's instruction and help. So we see the first characteristic that's presented in this lesson, marks of a spiritual leader: show concern for the people you lead. What would happen if you were in charge of a group of people and didn't show concern for them? Would they follow? Mrs. Jones told me a story once when she was in the Army of concern that one of her superiors showed for her. She had, I believe it was a sergeant, who she felt was very, very unreasonable in his requests and demands of those under his command. And so she went to the superior and expressed that concern. And he said, "Thank you for coming to me." He said, let me put it to you this way. If your sergeant were to tell you to march through a pond full of alligators, that is an unreasonable request, and I want you to tell me about it. But when you come to tell me, you better be covered with alligator bites. So a little bit of humor there. But the point is, if you want people to follow your leadership, you have to show that you're concerned for them. And a great way to show concern for people is to be a spiritual leader, so that God is working through you, and they can have confidence in God's leadership, God's direction in your life as you lead them. Okay, so that really finishes up the lesson. We have some time left. Anyone have any questions or anything to add to that?
I just wonder about verse 3, the 4 things, I think. You said 3, but I got 4 out of that. Affliction, reproach, broken down, burnt with fire. I just wondered, as you think about a city, those breaches, that which is more important than the other? A gate, a wall. As Satan attacks us, he's going to attack us in the weakest place. So if you have a city surrounded by a wall and gates, what's the first weakness that we have? That our city would have. I mean, the walls are made of stone, right?
The walls were probably made of logs, of wood.
Rotten wood. The walls are made of what? Wood?
That's my understanding, yes. Yeah. I could be wrong, but that's what I recall.
I just get the idea of a stone wall versus a wooden gate,
Yeah.
whereas the gate would be the first point of attack, I would think. Oh, well.
Yeah. Well, and maybe I'm wrong. Anyone else want to? What were the walls made of? Anyone know for sure?
Well, we know right now, those are walls of stone.
Yeah. So it probably was stone. Probably, yeah. Stone would certainly be much more available in that time and place.
I'm just kind of spiritualizing a fortress. If you ever visited in the Jerusalem area, there just isn't any trees. I mean, because it's a desert-like area.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
And
That's true. And you know, I was thinking of but this was the temple. They imported logs for the building, but that was for the temple. That's different. Yeah. Yeah.
The city walls usually were, I thought anyway. I just think in spiritualizing that if we see ourselves as a city or a temple,
Yeah.
our protection around us, the first place would be the gate, I would think. They would be shooting arrows or spears with fire to burn the gate down so that then the Lord's command to probably break the walls down from within and without. I don't think.
Yeah. That's a good point. One thing to keep in mind: neither is much good without the other.
That's true.
And by the way, Art, I said three things. Is I included the broken down walls and the burnt gates under the category of disrepair. So that's why I said three things. But you're right.
That's why I'm trying to differentiate some bit of difference between the two. The daily in and out is not in and out of the wall, but it's in and out of the gate. So
Right.
that the gate is vulnerable more so than the wall. That's just.
Okay. Good thought. Anything else?
I don't know, when you think of like the country of Lebanon, they have what they call the Lebanon Sea.
Mm-hmm.
But that's about the only place in that whole area of the world that has many trees. So anytime you go to Jerusalem or Bethlehem or wherever you're going to go, almost everything is by granite or rock or cement or bricks and so on.
So what, Larry? What is the national crop of Israel? It's rocks. Rocks.
Yeah, it is that. It is because it's much, you know, that Jerusalem's at an elevation of 2,500 feet. And then I think of Shushan, which is just right down to even less than that. And as we speak today, Shushan is strictly an archaeological site. There's nothing there, absolutely nothing. It's just flat desert. There isn't a tree within miles, you know. There's nobody living there. I don't think there's anybody living in that area. And many of the archaeological sites in the Bible that are mentioned, like Ephesus and some of those early towns that Paul spent time in, there's nothing there but archaeological sites. Corinth is the same thing.
All right. Good comments. Anything else?
Back to what Martin was saying, Proverbs talks about the person who can't control his spirit, like a broken down, without walls.
Yeah, a city with no walls broken down. Yes.
And then he also talks about, a little different, but talks about a slothful man whose gates are broken down and walls around his property. It's not quite the same, but similar.
So continuing in, and I saw your hand, Dan. I'll get to you. Continuing on in that vein of looking at the wall from a spiritual sense, what then is our wall? What things can be our wall to protect us?
Good point, good question. Might be several things, but I would think it's our cohesiveness as a church.
Okay.
The gate would be probably the study of God's word. You could probably put a lot of different things in there, but it certainly has to do with how we protect ourselves.
Okay, so the strength and protection we gain from our relationship with each other, being a family, okay? And yeah, and you said his word, thy word have I hid in my heart that I might not sin against God. And knowledge of God's word is a great defense. How about love for God? You know, a desire not to hurt him or bring shame to his name.
Look at the attack now on the church, and that's what it's all about, COVID-19. It boils down to attack on God's people. But what's it doing to us? It's breaking down the walls. The walls that represent our strength, cohesiveness, and agreement, and study of God's word together. So that's one of the first things
we're kind of going far afield here, but it is interesting. It wasn't that long ago that society and government's view of the church is you can do whatever you want within the walls of your church. But now it's gotten to the point where they want control of what happens within the walls of the church. So, like I say, we're kind of migrating a little ways away, but that's okay. It's all good conversations. Do you have something you want to share, Ms. Mullins? Right. Okay, thank you for those good comments and remarks. That was a good discussion. Next week, Mr. Jones will be teaching the lesson. You can see the topic, you can see the text if you'd like to look ahead on that and have some thoughts and preparation.
I talked to Rick recently about this a couple days ago. He said he'll be able to, so I'll go ahead and take it.
Okay, are you going to follow this or are you going to go back and finish?
I'll finish up Galatians.
All right.
So chapter end of chapter 6.
Okay, so the Sunday after next, Lord willing, this is what we'll be doing next week. Pastor Hicks is going to finish up in Galatians 6. All right, yeah, Rick was going to cover for me next Sunday, but I'm sure he is feeling a little run down and tired and also behind on a lot of things right now. Sure. Okay, well, thank you. All right. Larry, would you close in prayer?
Father, once again, we thank you for this blessed time, Lord, and we've been able to open up the word, Lord, and to feast upon it, Lord. We trust that you'll apply it to our lives, Lord. I trust that you continue to guide us, Lord. We thank you for the teaching of Brother Bob and his efforts to present the word of God to us, Lord. And we ask you now to guide us now as we go into the morning services, Lord, and Pastor Hicks as he presents the morning message.